We have an option again this week to tune into the French language audio for anyone who needs it. Through that, you'll find Marina and Alexandra interpreting for us today. Thanks for being here to translate live into French for us during this session. I'm Amber. I'm the Tree Planting Resource Manager with the Reforest Canada Collective, or RCC for short, and I'll be hosting today. We also have Sarah Barker, Project Manager with the RCC, who can be found in the chat. She's there to help you with anything else you need during this session. Please note that this session will be recorded, and we will post a link on our website soon on the Knowledge Hub. As mentioned, this webinar series is hosted by the Reforest Canada Collective. This collective is a 2 billion tree funded initiative launched in December of 2024. The RCC exists to support the implementation of 2 billion tree projects across the country, and we do this by creating a platform for Canada's tree planting community to connect, collaborate, and share knowledge. This webinar series is one of the first of our offerings, as many 2 billion tree projects are being implemented on post-wildfire sites. As a community-driven initiative, we invite you to visit our website to learn more and to reach out to discuss any ideas and how the RCC can help you with your organization. We will hear from 3 speakers today, and we'll open up the floor to questions at the end. Please use the Q&A box to type in any questions that you may have for the speakers. We welcome participation as well in the chat, so feel free to introduce yourself and let us know where you're calling in from, including the traditional territory if you like. The organizing team and speakers today are joining this session from the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Kanien'kehá:ka, Mississauga, Anishinaabeg, Algonquin, Huron-Wendat, Leilitane, Kuglicum, or people of sugarcane, and Secotmic. We recognize the essential role that fire has played in the traditions and practices of many Indigenous peoples in what we now call Canada, and we hope to give a platform to discussions that advance the integration of this role that the role that cultural burning can play as well in landscape restoration. This series will highlight Canadian research on forest dynamics in a changing climate and provide a few examples of the different approaches for tree planting after wildfire. The approaches and strategies presented today are being trialed in specific ecological contexts. The intention is not to advocate that these approaches be duplicated in other sites across the country, but rather to share ideas, options, and insights about what is working and what may not be working. To help everyone do that, we'll be compiling notes, learnings, and takeaways from each session of this series to summarize the knowledge shared. I'm happy to introduce Val Deziel, Director of Restoration Programs at Forest Canada. She's going to be our moderator today. Val is a grasslands and woodland management expert. She has a wealth of knowledge in the use of prescribed fire as a tool for landscape restoration, and she's an RX 200 burn boss with over a decade of experience in this practice. Thanks for moderating today's session, Val.
Thank you so much, Amber. I'm very happy to be moderating today's session. This series is all about sharing research on forest dynamics and a few examples of different approaches being used for tree planting after wildfire. And this is only the beginning. We recognize that more research and experimentation is needed to fully understand best practices for this type of restoration in Canada. We want to recognize that post-wildfire recovery is a developing field with few established experts, making peer learning and collaboration with researchers and knowledge holders essential for implementing this important work effectively. The focus of today's session, high severity, is something that has been on everyone's mind when we think about tree planting after fire. Fire weather is classified as extreme by the Canadian Forest Services using the Canadian Forest Fire Weather Index, or FWI. When the FWI value exceeds the 95th percentile of the average, these are the scenarios where fires are burning through organic layers, affecting regeneration success of trees and leading to challenges with artificial regeneration. Conditions are very dry, and you can have a lot of variation in the plant communities coming up in the years following the fire. Tree planting becomes a creative endeavor when working with these types of landscapes. I'd like to thank our speakers today for offering their time for this webinar session to help us understand more about the approaches that can be used to recover these types of landscapes. Up first is Dr. Nelson Thiffault, who is a governmental research scientist based in Quebec, Canada, specializing in regeneration silviculture. His research notably addresses challenges in reforestation, density management, and ecology. Since 2005, he has contributed to the scientific community as the associate editor for international journals and was recently appointed co-editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal for Forest Research. Dr. Thiffault also serves as an adjunct professor at several universities where he mentors and supervises graduate students. Since 2007, he has been a member of the Centre for Forest Research, Canada's largest forest ecology research centre. Welcome, Dr. Thiffault.
Thank you so much. I'll share my screen. There you go. Can you confirm it's working?
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay, thank you so much. So welcome everybody. I'll just say a few words in French and then I'll switch back to English in a few seconds. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Merci de votre présence aujourd'hui. Je suis heureux de savoir qu'il y a de la traduction simultanée et je veux juste vous préciser que si vous voulez me poser des questions en français, soit dans le chat, le Q&A ou par courriel, n'hésitez pas à le faire. Ça va me faire plaisir d'entrer en contact avec vous. So I thought that today I would glance over three main topics related to reforestation success after wildfires. First, I want to tackle the question as to why do we even have to think about reforestation efforts after wildfires? Then summarize some of the key factors that are driving artificial regeneration success in terms of survival and growth. And third, visit some research results from an experiment that we established in northern Quebec a few years ago, as I think that this experiment is relevant to our current context. So first, why do we have to think about reforestation efforts? Wildfires, are part of the natural disturbance regime of boreal forests for thousands of years. But the thing is that when specific factors come together, specific conditions, they can create what we called regeneration failures. So a few years ago, with colleagues from the Canadian Forest Service, we wanted to understand what we know about the potential for climate change to create more of these regeneration failure problems. So we conducted a thorough literature review focused on four main boreal species and looking at what do we know on temperature, high temperature and drought impacts on the regeneration process. So here on the left, what you have is are the summary results for one of those species, so black spruce. And what we found is that although we don't know much about how high temperature and drought impact seed production in mature trees, we do know based on several experiments that high temperature and drought events do negatively affect the regeneration of black spruce. It negatively affects seedling growth as well and survival, thus having this potential to cause regeneration failure. Now, to what extent do we see that across the landscape? I have colleagues that use innovative approaches using remote sensing and enable them to track at a large scale the post-fire recovery rates of forest. But we also have some field experiment looking at these factors and try to understand how they come together to create those regeneration failure events. So, for example, here the work of PhD student Stelsa Fortin at UQAC, she's using data from over 500 plots distributed in tens of fires in northern Quebec to see how fire has impacted regeneration in those stands. So from those 536 plots, she observed that most of them had regenerated with black spruce. Some proportion were regenerated with jack pine. A few of them had a hardwood component. And some of them had no regeneration at all. But what's important here is that even those plots that did have some kind of regeneration, as you see on the pie chart here, for the majority of them, this regeneration was low or would be considered as a failure in terms of bringing back enough seedlings to guarantee the return of a productive forest stand. And once the decision to plant on those sites is taken, what are the factors that impact the most the regeneration success of those newly planted seedlings? Where there are a few of them, both above ground and below ground, and it all comes down to the capacity of the planted seedling to acquire the environmental resources that they need to survive and grow. So here we think about light. We think also about water availability, which is a critical factor during the first year following planting, but also the access to nutrients to support their growth. Um, Now, what can silviculture do to support, to enhance the establishment success of those newly planted seedling? So a few years ago, we decided to tackle the question by looking at regeneration treatments in a recently burned site in northeastern Quebec. So for these stands were burned in 2007, and this is what they looked like 2 years after the fire. So what you can see here is a complete lack of conifer regeneration and an increasing dominance by ericaceous shrub species such as a bog Labrador tea and vaccinium, so blueberries here in the back, and ground lichens. So what we wanted to do in this experiment is to compare a few options of mechanical site preparations and other innovative silviculture approaches to support regeneration success following plantation. So what we did is we established a few of those treatments, and here I list 3 of them. There on the top right, you have a control treatment, of course, in which we planted the seedlings directly in the soil without any mechanical site preparation treatment. Then a standard mechanical site preparation treatment here, where the seedling is planted on the edge of the trench. And finally, we also tested the planting of seedlings following mechanical site preparation with a companion species, in this case, alder, because of the known capacity of alder to fix atmospheric nitrogen and thus help the seedling to cope with the scarcity of resources on those sites. We visited the site back 3 years later, and what we observed in terms of seedling diameter at the ground level, both for black spruce on the left and jack pine on the right, is a positive effect of mechanical site preparation on seedling dimensions. So you see here the difference between the blue and the green bars. But what's more interesting, though, was that for jack pine, we did see a positive effect of planting a companion species with the jack pine that in fact was equivalent of conducting an even more intensive mechanical site preparation treatment, which is this last column here that we called double disc trenching. So we again revisited this site after 6 growing season, and here what I'm presenting are the growth patterns of both black spruce on the left and jack pine on the right in terms of height in the different treatments. So if we first concentrate on the green dots, these represent the control conditions. So you can see that for both black spruce and jack pine, seedlings planted in control plots exhibited a linear growth. So they lost this typical exponential growth that we usually see in young planted seedlings. But as soon as we used some kind of mechanical site preparation, and these would be the orange and red dots here, you can see that both for black spruce and jack pine, there's a significant and positive response of the seedlings in terms of height growth when planted in those plots. And again, for jack pine, if you look at year 6 and you compare the orange dot, which is conventional mechanical site preparation, with the red dot, which is the addition of a companion species, we did see a significant positive impact of alder on jack pine growth. Of course, this is short term. 6 years is not that long, but we are eager to go back and see now what those sites look like about 13 to 14 years following planting, and verify if these differences have become more important over time. However, planting alder might also have some negative impact on seedling growth because, as you see here on the bottom right, you see that alder grows quite rapidly on those sites and can start becoming a competitor instead of a facilitator for the seedlings. And we verified that looking at a competition index that you see illustrated here in the bottom graph. So on the x-axis, the more you go to the right, the more intensive is the competition by alder. And you see that for both black spruce and jack pine, we see a significant decline as the competition goes up by alder. So in conclusion, and based on the research that we've done in these types of ecosystems, we can confirm that climate change threatens post-fire regeneration due to increasing fire frequency, temperature, and drought. That site preparation does increase seedling survival and growth, but that longer-term monitoring is necessary. The use of a companion species like alder can help conifers initially, but again, this might become a competitor over time. So we do need to be careful with that. But in all cases, adaptive silviculture to climate change needs to be developed and applied to ensure that these fire-affected sites are able to sustain ecosystem services. So thank you so much. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks.
Val, unmute it.
My apologies. Thank you, Dr. Thiffault. That was an excellent presentation and a wonderful research study. Thank you for sharing. Next, we have John Walker. John has lived in Williams Lake for 28 years and helped fight the mega fires of 2017. He has started employment with Williams Lake First Nation in 2019. With this position, he has developed a deeper understanding of Indigenous management in the stands of Williams Lake First Nation stewardship area. This knowledge gathering continues and allows him to manage and advocate on behalf of the community for holistic land management that improves the stewardship area for wildlife, fire mitigation, hydrology, carbon sequestration, and culturally important plants while considering climate change. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Val. I'll just get this shared. Am I in the right mode there, Amber?
Yeah, it looks great. Thanks.
Okay. Anyway, thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to share with you how fire has affected the past, present, and future forests in the Williams Lake First Nation traditional territory. This photo is a cultural burn we did within the city limits. It's a grassland restoration, very visible to the community of Williams Lake. And I wanted to share a quote from Dr. Deziel. Fire is a natural part of the environment, about as important as rain and sunshine. Fire has always been here, and everything good has evolved with it. And this statement rings true with First Nations values and oral history. These next couple of slides I borrowed from Dr. Kelsey Stokes-Derpsitz from UBC. She did a study up in Williams Lake on the community forest, studying tree ring data to see the intervals that fire returned to the landscape. And from her data, she was able to decipher that there was a lot of low and mixed severity fires on the landscape. And the number of fires on the landscape continued to increase until about 1922 when the railway and suppression efforts started. It's also interesting to note that low severity fire dwindled off when the gold rush and smallpox time frame. So to jump forward to today, or closer to today, we had a lot of habitat and silviculture / forestry burning occurring up to about 1998. And during that time, the fire severity, or the amount of area burnt, was fairly consistent and low. There was a couple of spike years, but overall it stayed on a low level. Then once those processes stopped, we started seeing bigger spikes and more consistent spikes. And now we're into the mega fires that started in 2017. So why are we seeing such extreme fire behavior? Fire's been excluded from the landscape for over 100 years, which has allowed for a lot of ingress of trees. They're suppressed. There's tons of ladder fuels. They're causing drought conditions in the forest. And when a fire starts, it's so easy for it to go from the ground to the crown of the trees. And it's creating conditions that firefighters have never seen. This is a picture looking towards the reserve and on a fire that started July 7th of 2017, the first mega fire for Williams Lake. This forest was mostly a Douglas fir forest. The area would have had a history of cultural burning prior to colonization, and it burned pretty hot. We were able to salvage some of the timber for some economic value in a clear-cut type system. So I'm unsure what the forest floor looks like after one of these high severity fires go through. As you can see, there is no organic layer. It's completely scorched, and I'm honestly surprised that something will grow on it again as fast as it has. So to start our process, we talk to the elders and listen. And one of the ways we do this is through a field tour. We take them out on the land every year, visiting different projects that we're doing. And they never ask about the monetary value of these projects. They ask about what plant communities are coming back. Is there berries? Is there medicines? And how is the wildlife doing? And if there's a Saskatoon bush, the tour stops for a bit. So then, from these talks, we came up with our planning thoughts. And one, we wanted to maintain areas of natural regeneration. Aspen was coming in. It's very important for biodiversity. So we tried to delineate where the aspen was. We wanted to create corridors with some gaps so it was fire resistant for the wildlife. We wanted to create grasslands to bring back that diversity on the landscape that has been missing for over 100 years. We wanted to match plant species with the appropriate to the appropriate site, taking into consideration the climate change. And we wanted to site prep in a way that least disturbs wildlife. They've been through a lot. They lost their habitat. We didn't need to stress them more. We needed to stabilize the soil to reduce the flooding that we saw after the fire. And we needed to restrict the access that we created with these salvage operations. So we started in 2019, planned it pretty sparse regeneration. We didn't have silviculture obligations on this area because the community wanted a more open forest. We did our road rehab in 2021, where we fully recontoured, and we created some roads that were just quad only to keep that recreational activities. And then we planted the sides, and then we started the bigger plants in 2022 to this year, 2025, and then we'll fill plant those areas again in 2026 and 2027. Want to note that we plant ponderosa pine, which is a species that is supposed to do well in this area with climate change. We also stopped planting spruce because with climate change, that species is not supposed to exist here in about 20 years. So like I said, we wanted to keep as much aspen as possible. This area is home to deer, moose, and elk, which are all sustenance species. And so they've been through a lot, and we need that biodiversity. So we chose to site prep using a hose grief technique, just basically a light touch to remove that competing vegetation. Thought this was the most natural and least disturbance to the wildlife. We noticed in areas where a different tenure holder did just trenching, the wildlife didn't use that area as much. So this is looking across to the reserve. You can see the checkerboard type pattern of the screefing we did. And then up on the right corner, you can see there was no site prep done. That area is going to be culturally burned to maintain as grassland. So this area is dry. It's windswept with it being clear cut. Relatively mild, I guess. So we were able to start planting here pretty early, around the last 2 weeks of April, which is great for the tree planting companies because they get an area where they can start training their staff and reintroducing them to the movements of planting, and we get our seedlings in early while there's still moisture from the winter to help them get established. But like I said, it's harsh, windswept. So these pictures were taken 2 years after the seedlings were planted. They're not taking off, but they're still alive. They're a bit chlorotic, but there's a lot of hope for them because they did survive some pretty harsh conditions. So we have been seeing quite a bit of mortality, and there's a few reasons for this. A lot of this area is south facing, so it's getting extreme sunshine and temperature changes. We had the heat dome, which definitely affected things. We're seeing the drought conditions throughout the winter and the summer lately, and we get growing season frost in this area. So that's really hard on the Douglas fir. And then we also have the ungulate and cattle damage. So the seedling on the left is a pine seedling that the deer ripped out of the ground the same day it was planted. And on the right, you can just see how dry this ecosystem is. So in the future, we need to stub more trees in these fire salvage areas so we can create better microsites to protect the seedlings from the sun and the frost. And we also are going to change to only site prepping when the vegetation is too dense. The sparse vegetation will help hide the seedlings from the ungulates and create obstacles for planting to help protect the seedlings from the frost and the sun. We're going to plant less lodgepole pine because the deer were extremely attracted to lodgepole pine. Not really sure why, and they shouldn't be. I think it may have been fertilizer in the plug, but who knows? And we're going to look at the plant communities to identify what areas should have been grassland. We noticed this year when checking up on the planting, there was some grassland species where we had planted, and we went off the government's grassland benchmark, and it was created after fire was already excluded from the landscape for 80 years. And then we need to listen to land modifier expectation. Not every area needs to have 1,200 stems per hectare. Maybe it's 500 is the best for it. Maybe it's 3,000, who knows? But we need to listen to the land and modify our regulatory thoughts. So some of the benefits to the First Nation-led management is we're going to end up with a forest that's more resilient to wildfire with species that are adapted to climate change. And this area is going to have more diverse vegetation with berries and medicines. The wildlife are going to have corridors where they have some visual screening and some thermal cover. These forests will become carbon sinks because they're more resilient to pest and wildfire. All in the same time, we're going to increase the terrain stability. And lastly, it will be an increase of good fire on the landscape. Fire is very important to the First Nations. It was used as a management tool, and now we're seeing the result of taking fire off of the landscape. Thank you, and I also apologize for not having my picture. I had some technical difficulties this morning.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. I really liked your words that listen to the land and manage expectations. I thought that was fantastic. Great presentation. Finally, we have Jordan Todd, who started as a tree planter at Folklore Contracting in 2004. After several years working as a planter and And then as a crew leader, he began supervising crews as a full camp manager. For the past 6 years, he has worked as a project coordinator for Folklore. During his career, he has been involved with many WRP Section 108 projects, as well as non-obligation planting projects, including those being funded by Forest Investment Program, carbon credit initiatives, and the federal $2 billion tree program. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you, Val. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Are my slides showing?
Yep, you're good to go now.
Okay, once.
You just had it. The from first slide. There you go. Perfect.
Okay. Thanks again, Val, for the introduction. My presentation kind of implicitly addresses tree planting strategies that lead to successful reforestation projects. And I apologize in advance for any overlap with other presentations. Please ask me in the Q&A period if you're looking to address any specific challenge or prescription, and I'll do my best to answer. So I wanted to start with differences in strategies between wildfire projects and more conventional tree planting. Typically, the first surveying that is done uses LiDAR to map out the areas that are affected by wildfire. The next step usually involves drone or helicopter aerial footage to help remove areas where the fire was less intense and likely not requiring any artificial reforestation. Then usually a more detailed systematic survey may be taken of the proposed reforestation area to hone in on future prescriptions and planting specs. And this already involves more than is typical of obligation traditional planting projects. And to further complicate things, it has, if it's been 2 to 5 years between the initial surveys and tree planting, things can drastically change. This could include unexpected natural regeneration over time or prohibitive vegetation growth, which are two of the most significant changes that could occur during that time. And this can all present significant logistical and financial challenges to a project. Seed must also be procured in order to sow seedlings to plant in the wildfire affected areas. The difference here is that the seed may not be readily available. And in order to acquire seed for the project, it usually must be purchased from a licensee if they have it, or it has to be collected as part of the project itself. In some cases, regardless, the seed must be collected as part of the project because no other party has collected the seed yet, and it cannot be purchased. For some projects, non-commercially popular seed may be prescribed. Not only does this seed typically need to be collected as part of the project, it can be difficult to find a nursery that is able to grow that seedling. This is usually due to the typical nursery's lack of experience or desire to grow niche stock. Whether an area is burned, is a burned plantation or burned mature forest can have a significant impact on the viability and prescription of a reforestation project. Access challenges are more likely to be significant when replanting a mature forest. If it wasn't previously logged, it's likely that there aren't any roads to or through the area. A burn plantation is more likely to require some sort of site prep application due to the density of the dead stock, and in some cases, vegetation could be more competitive due to increased sun exposure. Mature forest is more likely able to efficiently reforest on its own, whereas a younger plantation may not. Access challenges can also be extremely prohibitive. A significantly large amount of these wildfires occur on land that wasn't previously logged. Like I mentioned before, if it wasn't logged, then there is a good chance that it's difficult to access. In these cases, roads need to be built, which is very expensive, or the work needs to be done at remote camps using helicopters, which is also cost prohibitive. Also, after these areas, after an area has experienced a wildfire, regardless of whether or not there is existing access, extreme wildfire events often change the landscape, burning bridge infrastructure and increasing the frequency of landslides and floods. This can all have a drastic impact on our ability to access and reforest these areas. Poor access and increasingly decadent stands pose significant safety risks, with those which require specific emergency response plans, personal protective equipment, and may altogether be too dangerous to reforest. When it comes to funding, areas that have relatively easy access will almost always be favored, with more expensive, harder to access areas being left alone, likely forever. There are added layers of organization and stakeholder communication that are needed when establishing a wildfire restoration project. This includes government licensee and First Nation permission, consultation, information sharing, and involvement that often occurs outside of more conventional reforestation frameworks. For example, in Alberta, we work with local licensees to get historical information regarding the wildfire affected area. And we also rely on these licensees to submit wildfire project to the government via their annual operating procedures, or AOPs. Overall, when compared to a conventional reforestation project, wildfire restoration projects can add a level of uncertainty, complexity, risk, and liability, and overall difficulty that can prohibit restoration efforts. This is due in part to the slightly ad hoc relationships between the stakeholders who are involved. Due to all of these factors, the timeline for viable reforestation can be tight. Optimally, to achieve success, we must identify areas in need of reforestation and plant them as soon as possible, usually between 2 to 6 years after the fire. And here are just some examples of a plantation that was flooded, a road that was washed out in an area, a bridge that was burned and is not usable after a wildfire, and then a landslide blocking a road that we eventually had to use helicopter to access that area. And this was my trailer parked in a silviculture camp site. A few days after this happened, we were supposed to have a 60-person camp on this site. And we were just lucky that it flooded before everyone showed up. And this was directly after a wildfire had swept through this area. There was a heavy rain, and in part due to the lack of living vegetation to soak up all that water, the area experienced some very significant flooding. Now, artificial regeneration, as was previously mentioned, is not always needed. This is an example 3 to 4 years after a wildfire. You can see that the pine is growing in extremely thick. But sometimes, as mentioned previously, reforestation is needed due to dry or hot wildfire conditions, where nothing really is expected to go back on the landscape for a long time. And additionally, there are areas where the only thing that comes back right away is thick vegetation, and this vegetation can prohibit the success of viable seed growing into healthy trees on those sites. Due to climate change, we're seeing more high-intensity wildfire activity than is the norm. And sometimes, as was previously mentioned, fires are so hot that they burn everything, seeds, roots, and soil. In ecosystems that are historically dry to begin with, they're seeing more acute heat and drought events, which can impact the forest's ability to regenerate, again, due to climate change. Strategies like planting larger stock with deeper, more developed roots can help with this, along with intentional microsite selection made by the planters. For example, favoring sites with more moisture and shade can be the difference between a live seedling and a dead seedling. The landscape can be often nutrient poor. So sometimes the fire burns everything to the point where there isn't much left to provide nutrients. In these cases, replanting with additional fertilizer might be a good option. Wildlife and livestock browsing is an issue in many areas. This is especially the case when a fire has killed everything else, leaving really only young seedlings to eat. And eat they do. This can include insects such as black army cutworm, which will eat every little last green seedling naturally growing or planted immediately after a fire. With livestock, microsite selection can again help. Typically, site preparation that site prescriptions that require obstacle planting help dissuade browsers as the food is less convenient. Certain site prep, such as mounding and trenching, can help create these obstacles as well. Also, there are products that can be applied at the nursery to make the seedling an unattractive snack due to its smell and taste. In some cases, there are certain species that just don't come back on the landscape after a fire, even if their presence before was previously significant. I've heard, and it's been mentioned, that this is often the case with black spruce in some areas. In other cases, we may see a benefit to reintroducing or helping along certain species in order to achieve certain wildfire reduction, wildlife benefit, or culturally significant species goals in an area. And as the climate changes, we have had to start planning ahead, making climate-adjusted prescriptions that take into account shifting BEC zones and climate patterns. We have to do our best to anticipate the movement of previously non-native species into different areas, as well as the likelihood of the rise and decline of historically present species, and adjust our efforts. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jordan. And thank you to all of our speakers. Now we're going to open up the question and answer period. We have a question here from an anonymous attendee for John. John, you mentioned not planting spruce because of future climate predictions indicating that species will not be present. Can you share more about the decision making on this?
Yeah, so the year after we planted that, I was at the Professional Forestry Conference, and that there was a presenter that was talking about climate change and what would exist in the IDF, what wouldn't, and they said that spruce was one of the species that would be on its way out. Also, lodgepole pine will start not being it'll start having reduced growth here as well. So just with that knowledge, and we made that change. But to be honest, we probably planted too much spruce anyway because it is so dry. We were trying to put it around areas where there was some wetlands and stuff, but realistically, it was probably more fir to start anyway.
It is definitely challenging, isn't it? Our next question is from Tasso Bozic, directed at Nelson. Nelson, if you could answer this live, I would appreciate that. Have you done soil tests for nutrients level prior to tree planting in your experiments?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, yes, we did. And it was in part to enable us to test our hypothesis related to the use of alder as a companion species, because on those sites, and depending on the severity of the fire, you can have losses of key nutrients, including nitrogen. So by planting alder, we thought that using a nitrogen fixing species, we could increase nitrogen level in the soil enough for the planted species to take advantage of that. So yes, we did carried out nutrient measurements in the soil pre and post treatment. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Next question is for Jordan from an anonymous attendee. Jordan, what is your opinion on tea bag fertilizer packs at time of planting? Does it assist seedling survival?
Yeah, so I definitely think there are applications or instances where they are very effective and sometimes where they're not very effective. So the first thing that kind of leads to a successful fertilizer application is basically, how it's applied. So typically you don't want a fertilizer pouch to be directly up against the plug of a tree because there's a high risk of a chemical burning, which isn't good for the tree. Typically you want to make sure it's in, I think the general consensus now is you prefer to have it in the same hole as the tree, but not touching, and then and towards the top of the plug. So just under the surface of the soil so that the nutrients, the fertilizer kind of flows downwards over where the tree's roots are. But you have to cover it with enough dirt and whatnot so you don't get animals interest in digging them up, especially birds. So in some situations, we planted we planted millions of seedlings around the areas that John spoke about west of Williams Lake, and we did do a lot of fertilizer applications, and we did see some success there. The limiting factor with fertilizer pouches, as opposed to maybe doing a complementary seeding of a nitrogen fixer, is that the fertilizer bags only last for maybe a few years before their benefit runs out. And they're an added cost both to create, transport, and plant.
Thank you, Jordan. This is from an anonymous attendee to John. John, do you know of any other practices or approaches that are being trialed to provide browse supplement diets for wildlife in the early stages after planting?
No, I don't.
Okay. An anonymous attendee is asking any of the participants, what about larch? Any trials on planting those post-wildfire? Nelson, you're nodding. Would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting comment. We haven't tested larch after fire, but we do have tested mix planting between larch and black spruce after harvesting them, and we do see a positive beneficial effect of having larch on those sites that get in the boreal forest, sites that would get not invaded, but encroached by ericaceous species, and larch, because of its foliage, has a positive effect on soil nutrients, and then you start to see this positive feedback loop with conifer growing faster, producing more litter, and that starts to influence their own microsites. So yes, we've measured that with larch, but not in my case after fire, but after harvesting. That's a very good comment.
Thank you very much, Nelson. An anonymous attendee asks to all, so anyone open to anyone to answer, can aerial seeding approach, seeding with drone companies like Flash Forest, be effective in post-fire stands? And what do you think?
Yeah, so maybe I'll weigh in a bit on this one. There are very limited applications where aerial drone seeding is effective. Those situations where aerial seeding might be preferred would be in very remote areas, again, that are hard to get at on the ground for people. But they're very restricted in that to be remotely successful, the wildfire has to come through and burn a lot of the litter on the ground. And the seeds, it has to be seeded pretty quick before competition comes back in. The main concern with aerial seeding and why it hasn't really caught on yet is because there's quite a bit of seed waste. For example, the Ministry of Forests in BC is very, very, very cautious about doing any aerial seeding work because they realize that our seed is a very valuable resource, and the amount of wasted seed and the potential risk of these plantations not taking is a real issue. And that's why they usually prefer to go with the old-fashioned on the ground planting of seedlings.
Thank you, Jordan. Any other panelists wish to comment?
I guess they're doing they did a trial just west of Williams Lake, and it didn't, like Jordan said, it seemed to be not great survival. But I was there the first year after, and I haven't revisited it since. But I think it's good for probably remote areas where it's hard to get into, but for the most part, traditional planting is probably still the way to go.
Thank you. Next question from an anonymous attendee for Nelson. Long term, would you suggest that the use of alder is necessary?
Good point. I think that from what we've measured, the main benefits of using a mix of alder with those conifers is to create a microclimate that enables the seedlings to go through the first few years, maybe the first decade, and get established until they start to influence their own microsite. But again, I think it will be worth revisiting this experiment, and I know that there are other ones elsewhere in Canada, just to see how things evolve over time. But yeah, my thinking now is that the first few years, maybe the first decade is critical, but after that, maybe not so much. In terms of seedling, in terms of conifer establishment and growth, having alder on the site and other species might have a long list of other benefits, though, for the ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. This next one is for Jordan, from Stephen Kisaki. Hi, Jordan. What did you mean by niche forest seedling stock types? That is, do you have a stock type preference for these wire burnt sites? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So by niche, I mean anything from currently uncommon plug sizes. So nurseries are currently experimenting with different plug sizes, whether they be longer, deeper root systems and or wider, more developed root systems in order to help set up the seedling for better success in drought-prone areas. But also, typically in industry, commercial nurseries typically focus on the commercially logged conifer species. And when we're focusing on these reforestation projects, we really have an opportunity because the goals aren't necessarily on to log these areas for fiber. We have an opportunity to introduce and then help along different species, like a variety of deciduous trees that are native to the landscape, that are typically suppressed, or other shrubs and bushes that, again, are typically native to the area that may not be coming back, or that may have not existed in that area because it was a 30-year-old plantation, and all the trees came up too thick, not allowing anything to come back in the understory. So because a lot of nurseries don't have experience growing a variety of deciduous trees and shrubs and native plants, it's kind of difficult to find nurseries that are willing to take that on. And certainly difficult to find people and organizations that have this kind of seed that you can even provide to these nurseries. So that's kind of generally what I was referring to there.
Thanks, Jordan. This one's for John, an anonymous attendee. Did anyone conduct any carbon substances, CO2, CO impact estimations after the wildfire happened? And were the Indigenous communities involved?
No, we didn't, and most of our learnings have been through observation so far. But we are involved with Environment Climate Change Canada and the Silviculture Innovation Branch to do some studies on blocks that we're doing ecosystem restoration on. It's a thin from below, which will make it more fire resistant, and looking at that carbon a bit closer.
Great, thank you. This question comes from Matt McKernan. Nice to see you have returned for week 2, Matt. This question's for Nelson. Have you thought much about how mechanical site prep work could impact future wildfires? Do you think it disrupts the soil and creates more intense fires in the future? Curious to get your thoughts.
Wow, that's a very good question. In fact, when we established this this experiment I presented, creating kind of fire breaks was part of the original intent. And if I remember correctly, it had to do with disturbing the soil, in fact, exposing mineral soil on larger patches. But we ended not doing that for different reasons. So yeah, in terms of the actual impact of regular mechanical site preparation on, I must admit, I haven't thought about that before. That's a very good question, and I don't have an answer for you. I'm sorry.
Well, this is so great for us to be able
Yeah.
to ask these questions together and learn. I think we have time for one more question. Is that correct, Amber?
Yep, one more question. Your favorite one.
Well, there are so many good ones. I'm sorry, I can't get to them all, but this one from an anonymous attendee to Jordan. Do we need special fertilizer to compensate the nutrient deficiency in post-fire stands?
I think the best answer to that question is sometimes. I really do think that in a perfect world, we would be taking some soil samples on different sites before we engage in reforestation projects. But certainly, in some cases, and you saw some pictures and some others comment on this as well. There are sites that are obviously the fires come through and burn everything down to mineral soil, and there's not much left. And in that case, I think it's well worth considering either performing a fertilizer application or trying to figure out whether it's alder or another native species that can act as a nitrogen fixer, because even if the trees survive, the seedlings survive the first 1 or 2 years, they're going to have a hard time growing, and they're going to be kind of open to disease and drought conditions over a longer time span because of their struggling in those soil conditions.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. I'll just conclude today's session with a few final remarks and some information on upcoming events, opportunities to keep learning that might be of interest. When it comes to wildfire recovery, there will never be a one-size-fits-all approach for tree planting and restoration. What we do know for certain is that the period after a fire, when the landscape starts to come back to life, there is a critical time when we can make sound decisions about restoring forests through tree planting for maintaining ecological integrity, while also mitigating future fire risks and adapting to our changing climate. It's important for us to have these conversations. Knowing more about who is already doing the work and research and this practice will add to the confidence levels needed to make these critical decisions. So thank you again, Dr. Thiffault, John, and Jordan for being so generous with your time and sharing your experiences today. I would also like to invite you all. Oh, are we done?
We've got, yeah, go ahead, keep going.
Oh, sorry. I would like to invite you all to Forest Canada's annual conference in Mississauga, Ontario on February 20th. It will be a jam-packed day of expert speakers and important discussions. The event will kick off the evening before, February 19th, with an evening social and awards. Register at forestcanada.ca/conference, and I hope to see you there.
Okay, and I'll just skip ahead to next week. We hope to see you back here next Wednesday, same time. We have a mix of topics: wildlife habitat, Indigenous involvement, and high severity continued with the BC Ministry of Forests. So I'm looking forward to that one as well. Thanks, everyone. The recording will be on our website soon on the Knowledge Hub. Have a great day.